The Arizona Territory, 1878. The unforgiving sun beat down on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small settlement nestled between the imposing Superstition Mountains and miles of unforgiving desert. Samuel Blackwood sat on the weathered porch of his modest cabin on the outskirts of town, rifle balanced across his knees as he surveyed the horizon with eyes that had seen too much. At 52, the former Army Scout's face was a roadmap of deep lines carved by harsh weather and harsher memories. His silver-streaked dark hair hung to his shoulders, and the scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth pulled slightly when he frowned, which was often these days. 20 years living alongside Apache scouts had taught Samuel how to read the land, and today, something didn't feel right. Hello, friends. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Samuel's fingers traced the worn grip of his Winchester, the habit born from years when survival depended on split-second reactions. The mountains loomed in the distance, their shadows growing longer as afternoons stretched toward evening. The place where he'd first met Running Elk, an Apache scout who'd saved his life during a Comanche raid and become the closest thing to a brother Samuel had known since the war. Running Elk had taught him the ways of the desert, how to track, how to survive, and most importantly, how to understand the complex relationships between the native tribes and the ever-encroaching settlers. It was Running Elk who had convinced Samuel to settle in Redemption Creek 5 years ago when the Army no longer needed scouts, telling him it was time to put down roots before the desert winds blew away what remained of his soul. Now, Running Elk was gone, killed 3 months ago in what the territorial authorities called a regrettable incident with local ranchers, though Samuel knew it had been nothing short of cold-blooded murder. The creak of wagon wheels drew Samuel's attention to the road leading into town. A single covered wagon approached slowly, pulled by 2 tired-looking horses. Not the usual trader's wagon or settler family. This one moved with purpose, but caution. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he watched the driver, a woman with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her face, handling the reins with practiced ease. Beside her sat a young Apache man, no more than 20, his posture rigid and eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. An unusual pairing that immediately put Samuel on alert. Few white women traveled with native companions in these parts, not with tensions running as high as they were. The Dawson brothers, who owned most of the cattle range and held considerable sway with the territorial officials, had been agitating against any Apache presence since a series of cattle thefts they'd conveniently blamed on the nearby reservation inhabitants. Samuel knew better. He'd tracked those cattle thieves himself at the sheriff's request and found evidence pointing to the Dawsons' own hired hands. Evidence that Sheriff Parker had promptly dismissed. The wagon slowed as it neared Samuel's cabin, and he found himself standing, an old instinct kicking in. The woman pulled the team to a halt and raised her head slightly, revealing a face that carried its own stories. She wasn't young, perhaps in her late 30s, with intelligent blue eyes that assessed him quickly. Her companion remained tense, one hand hidden beneath the seat, where Samuel would wager a weapon rested. "Mr. Blackwood?" the woman called, her voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education layered over something harder. "My name is Elizabeth Hargrove. Running Elk spoke of you in his letters. I believe we need to talk." The mention of his friend's name sent a jolt through Samuel, and his fingers tightened instinctively around his rifle. Running Elk had never mentioned any Elizabeth Hargrove, but then again, There were many aspects of his friend's life they'd never discussed. Sheriff Thomas Parker wiped sweat from his brow as he watched the wagon from the window of his office. Elizabeth Hargrove. The name had been circulating in telegrams between territorial officials for weeks. Schoolteacher turned journalist, known for her scathing exposés on corruption and the mistreatment of native populations. Trouble, in other words. Parker's stomach twisted uncomfortably as he recalled the hefty payment he'd received from James Dawson after ensuring the investigation into Running Elk's death went nowhere. Now this woman shows up with an Apache companion, heading straight for Samuel Blackwood, the one man in Redemption Creek with both the skills and the motivation to uncover what really happened that night. Parker reached for the telegram form on his desk. James Dawson would want to know about this development immediately. The sheriff hesitated only briefly before beginning to write, the scratching of his pen like the sound of coins dropping into a collection plate for his own damnation. At the Dawson Ranch, 10 miles outside of town, James Dawson stood on his porch, overlooking acres of prime grazing land, a kingdom built through 20 years of ruthless determination and strategic alliances. At 55, Dawson still cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a meticulously groomed beard that didn't quite hide the cruelty in his smile. His younger brother, Robert, stood beside him, more slight in build, but with the same cold calculation in his eyes. Mason didn't get the job done, Robert said, his voice low despite the fact that they were alone. Running Elk had papers, documents. The woman from the east was supposed to be taken care of before she ever reached the territory. James made a dismissive gesture with the hand holding his cigar. Mason's being dealt with. What matters now is containing this situation before it spirals. If those land deeds and survey maps become public, we lose everything. Elizabeth Hargrove had removed her hat once inside Samuel's cabin, revealing honey blonde hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a practical braid. The young Apache man had introduced himself simply as Joseph, his English precise and formal, though he'd said little beyond his name. Samuel studied them both as Elizabeth explained her presence. Running Elk and I corresponded for nearly 5 years, Mr. Blackwood. I was writing a series of articles about the territorial disputes and broken treaties. He provided valuable first-hand accounts. She hesitated, then reached into her satchel, removing a bundle of letters secured with twine. 3 months ago, his letters stopped. Then I received this from Joseph's mother. She handed Samuel a final letter, the paper creased and worn as though it had been read many times. He knew they were coming for him. He sent evidence, survey maps and land deeds, proving that the Dawson Ranch extends well into reservation land illegally. He'd discovered their cattle operation was merely a front for something much more valuable. Samuel's eyes moved over the cramped handwriting he recognized as Running Elk's, feeling the ghost of his friend in every carefully formed letter. Joseph finally spoke, his voice quiet but intense. There is silver in the eastern hills, rich deposits. The land was designated Apache territory in the Treaty of '68, but the Dawsons have been mining it secretly for 2 years. My uncle discovered their operation. That is why they killed him. Samuel looked up sharply at the word uncle, and Joseph nodded once in confirmation. Running Elk was my mother's brother. He sent me to school in Santa Fe. I returned when I learned of his death. The pieces clicked into place for Samuel. Running Elk had often spoken of a sister who had married into another band, had mentioned a nephew receiving education in the white man's world. Elizabeth leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together on the rough wooden table. Running Elk sent the documents to me for safekeeping, but we need your help to gather additional evidence. With your knowledge of the territory and your history with the Army, your testimony would lend crucial legitimacy to our case against the Dawsons. Night had fallen by the time their conversation ended, and Samuel offered them shelter until morning. As Elizabeth stepped outside to fetch her belongings from the wagon, Samuel noticed for the first time how she moved, carefully, as though in constant pain despite her efforts to hide it. Joseph saw his questioning look and spoke quietly. She was attacked 2 weeks ago in Santa Fe. Men sent by the Dawsons. They thought she carried the documents with her. His dark eyes held Samuel's steadily. She did not tell you because she does not want pity, but you should know what kind of men we are dealing with. Samuel felt cold anger settle in his chest, hardening his resolve. These were the same men who had murdered his friend, who now threatened a woman whose only crime was seeking justice. By the time Elizabeth returned, Samuel had made his decision. "We leave at first light," he told them. "I know where the Dawsons keep their records, and I know exactly how to get to them." In the pre-dawn gloom, 3 figures slipped away from Samuel's cabin, abandoning the wagon in favor of horses that would allow them to travel through the rough backcountry where no roads existed. Samuel led them along game trails and dry creek beds, routes known primarily to the native inhabitants and a few scouts like himself. They rode in silence until the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Only then did Samuel speak, pointing toward a distant mesa. "There's a network of caves there, Apache hiding place for generations. We can rest during the hottest hours and continue at dusk." Elizabeth nodded, though Samuel noticed the tightness around her eyes and the careful way she held herself in the saddle. Joseph had not exaggerated her injuries, yet she drove herself onward without complaint. It reminded Samuel of the Apache women he had known, steel, wrapped in quietude, enduring what had to be endured. Sheriff Parker stood in the Dawson brothers' study, hat in his hands, uncomfortably aware of the luxury surrounding him. Imported furniture, expensive whiskey in crystal decanters, oil paintings in gilt frames. "They're gone," he reported. "Blackwood's cabin is empty. Wagon's still there, but they took horses. 3 sets of tracks heading east into the Badlands." James Dawson's face remained impassive, but Robert paced the thick carpet like a caged mountain lion. "You should have arrested them immediately," Robert snapped. "On what charge?" Parker shot back, momentarily forgetting his place. "Looking at maps? Talking to Indians?" James raised a hand, silencing them both. "It doesn't matter now. They're headed for evidence or reinforcements, neither of which we can allow them to reach." He turned to a man standing silently in the corner, a tall, spare figure with a pockmarked face and dead eyes. "Mr. Reeves, it seems your services are required after all. Find them, the woman and the Indian. I want them alive if possible. We need to know who else they've been in contact with." Blackwood. He paused, swirling amber liquid in his glass. "Blackwood is expendable." By midday, the heat had become oppressive, the sun a merciless presence, beating down on the exposed landscape. The caves Samuel had mentioned provided blessed relief, cool, dark spaces, worn into the ancient stone by centuries of wind and flash floods. Samuel busied himself checking their supplies while Joseph scouted the area for signs of pursuit. Elizabeth sank gratefully onto a flat rock, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. Noticing her discomfort, Samuel offered her his canteen. "You should rest while you can. We've got a hard ride ahead once the sun sets." Elizabeth accepted the water with a nod of thanks, but her eyes remained alert, studying him. "Running Elk wrote about you often," she said after a moment. He said you were a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but understanding both. He respected that about you. Samuel looked away, uncomfortable with the assessment and the memories it stirred. Running Elk saw the best in people, even when it wasn't there to see. Elizabeth's lips curved in a sad smile. He said you'd say something like that. She hesitated, then continued more softly. He also told me about Antietam, about what you did for those men in your unit. Samuel's head snapped up, eyes suddenly hard. He had no right to share that story. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. He thought it explained something essential about your character, that despite everything you've seen and done, you still believe in justice. We need that now, Mr. Blackwood. The Apache people need it. Before Samuel could respond, Joseph appeared at the cave entrance, his expression grim. Riders, 5, maybe 6, moving fast. Samuel was on his feet instantly, gathering their belongings. We've been tracked sooner than I expected. We need to move now, stay ahead of them until nightfall. As they hurried to saddle the horses, Samuel made a decision. Change of plans. We're heading for the old mission at Broken Rock. It's closer than the caves I originally planned for, and we might find help there. The abandoned mission at Broken Rock stood against the evening sky like a sentinel from another time. Its adobe walls weathered but still sturdy, its bell tower missing the bell that had once called the faithful to worship. Samuel approached cautiously, rifle ready, memories flooding back of the last time he'd been here, during a peace negotiation that had ultimately failed like so many others. The mission had been abandoned for nearly a decade, the Franciscan brothers driven away by increasing violence as settlers pushed ever deeper into Apache territory. Wait here, he instructed Elizabeth and Joseph, dismounting and moving silently toward the main structure. The interior was cool and dark, thick walls keeping out the worst of the desert heat. Dust covered everything. The simple altar, the rough-hewn pews, the quarters where the brothers had slept. Samuel moved methodically through the rooms, checking for signs of recent occupation, finding none until he reached the small room that had once served as the mission's infirmary. A figure rose from the shadows, and Samuel raised his rifle in one fluid motion before recognition dawned. "Thomas Brokenshield," he breathed, lowering his weapon. The old medicine man nodded once in greeting, his weathered face betraying no surprise. "Samuel Blackwood, the spirit said someone would come." Thomas had been a fixture in Running Elk's band before most had been forced onto the reservation, a keeper of traditional knowledge who had formed an unlikely friendship with the Franciscan brothers and often served as intermediary between his people and the white settlers. Samuel had worked with him during his army days, respecting the old man's wisdom, even when his commanding officers dismissed it as superstition. "I'm not alone," Samuel said, holstering his weapon. "I have Running Elk's nephew with me, and a woman, a writer from back east. We're being pursued." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but his dark eyes sharpened with interest. Running Elk spoke of this woman in his last visit. "Bring them. You will be safe here tonight." Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the small room where Thomas Brokenshield had instructed her to rest, watching as the old medicine man arranged various pouches and bundles on a worn blanket. "Your injuries trouble you," he said without looking up, a statement rather than a question. Elizabeth's hand moved instinctively to her side, where the deepest knife wound was still healing. "I manage," she replied stiffly, reluctant to show weakness. Thomas finally raised his eyes to hers, his gaze penetrating in a way that made her feel transparent. "Pain carries wisdom if we listen. Yours speaks of courage." He gestured for her to sit on the simple cot, I can prepare a poultice that will ease the healing, but first I must see. Elizabeth hesitated, then slowly sat, her hands clenched in her lap. I prefer not to be touched, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded once, understanding in his ancient eyes. The body remembers what the mind wishes to forget, but healing requires acknowledgement. Outside the room, Samuel and Joseph discussed their next moves in low voices. The Dawsons will expect us to head for the territorial capital, Samuel reasoned. That's where you'd logically take evidence of their crimes. But there's a federal judge in Tucson who once served with me in the army. If we can get the documents to him, he has the authority to issue warrants that even the Dawsons can't ignore. Joseph considered this, then nodded slowly. But they will watch the direct routes to both places, and we are only 3 against their hired guns. Samuel's mouth set in a grim line. 4. Thomas is coming with us, and we won't be taking any direct routes. He spread a rough map on the ground between them, tracing a path with his finger. There's a network of canyons here that few white men know about. Thomas can guide us through. It adds 2 days to our journey, but keeps us hidden until we're nearly to Tucson. Joseph studied the map intently, memorizing the route. The woman, Elizabeth, will she be strong enough for such a journey? Samuel glanced toward the closed door of the room where Elizabeth was with Thomas. She's stronger than either of us knows, I suspect. Inside the room, Thomas worked silently, grinding herbs and minerals into a fine paste. The men who did this, he said finally, they sought something you carried. Elizabeth nodded, watching his hands work with practiced precision. Documents, maps, proof of the Dawsons' crimes. Thomas added a few drops of liquid from a small leather pouch, the sharp smell of juniper filling the small space. No, they sought to break your spirit. The papers were merely an excuse. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. But they did not succeed. This is why they will continue to hunt you. Men like these cannot abide an unbroken spirit, especially in a woman. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her at his words, recognition perhaps, or the validation of her own instincts about the attack. It hadn't been merely about silencing her work. It had been punishment for daring to challenge men like the Dawsons in the first place. The poultice is ready, Thomas said, offering her the small clay bowl. You will apply it yourself. I will turn away. As Elizabeth carefully lifted her shirt to reveal the angry red scars crisscrossing her torso, she felt tears threatening for the first time since the attack. Not from pain or fear, but from the simple dignity of being allowed to maintain her boundaries while still receiving care. Dawn brought a change in plans. Joseph returned from scouting with troubling news. Riders approaching from multiple directions, at least a dozen men converging on the mission. They've split up to surround us, Samuel concluded grimly. Someone must have seen us arrive. Elizabeth joined them in the main room, moving with more ease than the day before, Thomas's medicine having worked its quiet magic. There's another way, Thomas said, his voice measured. Beneath the mission lies an old escape route, dug by the brothers during the Apache raids of the 50s. It emerges in a box canyon 2 miles east. Samuel nodded, already gathering their essential supplies. We'll take only what we need. Leave false trails heading north for them to follow. As they worked, Elizabeth approached Samuel, speaking low so only he could hear. If we're cornered, take the documents and go with Joseph. I'll surrender myself. As a journalist, I have connections that might protect me." Samuel paused in his preparations, studying her face. "That's not how this works. We all make it, or none of us do." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "It isn't about heroics, Mr. Blackwood. It's about ensuring the evidence reaches the right hands." The underground passage was narrow and low, forcing them to proceed in single file, bent almost double in places. Thomas led the way, followed by Elizabeth, then Joseph, with Samuel bringing up the rear. The air was stale and thick with dust, making breathing difficult, but they pushed forward in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Samuel, the claustrophobic darkness triggered unwanted memories of Antietam, the smoke-filled chaos, the screams of the wounded. The trench he dug with his bare hands to shelter 3 critically injured men from his unit while the battle raged on. He'd stayed with them through the night, applying tourniquets, whispering reassurances, watching 2 die despite his efforts. The third, a young lieutenant named Harris, had survived to write a commendation that Samuel had wanted no part of. He'd deserted 3 weeks later, heading west where the open spaces offered escape from the suffocating weight of war. Now here he was, underground again, guiding others through darkness, the responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. They emerged into blinding sunlight, the Box Canyon's walls rising steeply around them. Thomas oriented himself quickly, pointing toward a narrow cleft, barely visible among the rocks. "That way lies a path the Apache have used for centuries. It will take us beyond the search area." As they began their careful ascent, a shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. Joseph cried out, dropping to one knee, blood blossoming on his left shoulder. Samuel spun, raising his rifle toward the canyon entrance, where a lone figure stood, rifle still raised. Even at this distance, Samuel recognized the pockmarked face of Nathan Reeves, the Dawsons' most notorious hired gun. Before Reeves could take another shot, Samuel fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet kicked up dirt at Reeves' feet, forcing him to step back. The second found its mark in his leg, dropping him momentarily. "Go!" Samuel shouted to the others, positioning himself to cover their retreat. "I'll hold him here." Elizabeth hesitated, clearly torn. But Thomas was already helping Joseph toward the hidden path. "Samuel Blackwood does what he must," the old medicine man told her firmly, "as must we." With a last glance at Samuel's resolute figure, Elizabeth followed, supporting Joseph as they scrambled up the rocky slope. Samuel maintained his position, exchanging fire with Reeves, who had taken cover behind a boulder. He wasn't trying to kill the man, not yet, merely keep him pinned down long enough for the others to escape. The standoff continued for several tense minutes until Samuel heard what he'd been dreading, the sound of multiple horses approaching. The rest of the search party, drawn by the gunfire. With a muttered curse, he fired one last barrage toward Reeves' position and then began backing toward the escape route, moving from cover to cover. A bullet grazed his arm, another shattered rock, inches from his head, but he kept moving, finally reaching the narrow cleft where the others had disappeared. As he squeezed through the opening, a burning pain exploded in his left leg. The bullet had found its mark, but Samuel pushed forward, disappearing into the shadows as riders flooded the canyon below. The next hours passed in a haze of pain and determination. Samuel refused to slow their pace despite his injury, wrapping the wound tightly and pressing onward through sheer force of will. Thomas led them through a labyrinthine network of canyons and ancient riverbeds, pathways invisible to anyone not raised in this harsh landscape. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers. Finding shelter in a small cave hidden behind a waterfall, one of the few reliable water sources in the region. As Thomas tended to Joseph's shoulder wound with practiced efficiency, Elizabeth insisted on examining Samuel's leg, despite his protests. "You've lost too much blood," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The bullet needs to come out." Samuel leaned back against the cave wall, suddenly too exhausted to resist. "You've done this before," he observed as she gathered supplies from Thomas's medicine pouch. Elizabeth's hands paused momentarily. "My father was a doctor in Philadelphia. I assisted him from the time I was 12. The bullet extraction was excruciating but necessary." Samuel gritting his teeth against the pain as Elizabeth worked with focused precision. "Why did you leave medicine for journalism?" he asked between labored breaths, partly out of curiosity, but mostly as distraction from the probing instruments. Elizabeth's eyes remained on her task, but something in her expression shifted. "I watched my father save countless lives, one patient at a time, but I saw how many of those same patients suffered from conditions created by corrupt systems. Unsafe working conditions, tainted water, inadequate housing. I thought perhaps words could change those systems in ways medicine couldn't." She finally located the bullet, extracting it with a swift movement that drew a sharp hiss from Samuel. "I was naive, perhaps. Words alone rarely change entrenched power." She began cleaning the wound methodically. "But they can expose truth, and sometimes that's where change begins." Samuel studied her face in the dim light, seeing the determination beneath her exhaustion. Running Elk believed that too. Joseph watched the exchange silently from across the small cave, his own wound bandaged, and his eyes reflecting the small fire Thomas had carefully built. "My uncle said the white man's greatest weakness was believing in their own lies," he said finally. "The lie that this land was empty when they came. The lie that treaties matter only when convenient. The lie that some lives are worth less than others." He shifted, wincing slightly. "But he also said their greatest strength was people like you, Miss Hargrove, people who question those lies." Elizabeth finished bandaging Samuel's leg and moved to sit beside Joseph. "Your uncle was an extraordinary man. The letters he sent me revealed a profound understanding of both cultures." She hesitated, then added more softly, "He was very proud of you." Joseph looked away, emotion briefly crossing his stoic features. "I was in school when he was killed. I should have been here." Thomas, who had been quietly preparing a medicinal tea, spoke without looking up from his work. "The path of a warrior is not always to fight. Sometimes it is to learn, to understand the enemy's ways." Running Elk knew this. He handed cups of the steaming liquid to each of them. "Drink. It will help you sleep and heal." As they sipped the bitter tea, Thomas continued, "Tomorrow we face the hardest part of our journey, the desert crossing. We must travel by night and hide by day. The Dawson's men will expect us to follow the water sources." Samuel nodded, already feeling the tea's sedative effects. "How long to reach Tucson?" Thomas considered for a moment. 3 nights, if we move well. 4 if the wounds slow us." Elizabeth set down her empty cup. "We'll make it in 3, she said with quiet determination, and Samuel found himself believing her despite everything they faced. Morning found them concealed in the cave, resting through the hottest hours as Thomas had advised. Samuel's fever had broken during the night, and he felt stronger than he'd expected, Thomas's medicine working its quiet magic. Joseph slept fitfully, his shoulder wound less severe than initially feared. Elizabeth sat at the cave entrance, partly hidden by the falling water, keeping watch. Samuel joined her, moving carefully to protect his injured leg. "You should be resting," she said without turning. Samuel eased himself down beside her. So should you. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the desert shimmer in the morning heat. When this is over, Samuel said finally, what then? For you, I mean. Elizabeth seemed surprised by the question. I file my story. The Dawsons face justice, hopefully. Then, there are other stories waiting. She looked at him directly. And you? What happens to Samuel Blackwood when justice is served for his friend? Samuel had avoided this question in his own mind, focusing only on the immediate goal of exposing Running Elk's murderers. I don't know, he admitted. This place has been home for a long time. But afterwards, he let the thought trail off, unable to envision a future beyond their current pursuit. Elizabeth studied him thoughtfully. Running Elk believed you stayed in one place physically because you were still running in your heart. From the war, from the choices you made. Samuel stiffened, about to object, but Elizabeth continued. He didn't say it as criticism. He thought everyone runs from something. The brave ones eventually stop and turn to face it. Before Samuel could respond, Joseph appeared at the cave entrance, fully alert despite his injury. Someone's coming, he said quietly. A single rider, moving slowly, like he's tracking. They retreated deeper into the cave, weapons ready, as Samuel calculated their options if they were discovered. The tension stretched until Thomas, who had joined them at the cave entrance, suddenly relaxed. It is a friend, he said with certainty. Minutes later, a weathered Apache man in his 30s appeared, leading his horse carefully along the nearly invisible path to their hiding place. Thomas greeted him in their shared language, a rapid conversation that excluded the others. Finally, Thomas turned to them. This is Swift Fox from the reservation. He brings news. The Dawsons have sent riders to every settlement within 50 miles. There is a bounty now. $500 for Samuel Blackwood, $1,000 for Elizabeth Hargrove and Joseph, dead or alive. Swift Fox spoke in carefully measured English. They say you murdered a rancher near Broken Rock. They say the woman is a thief who stole valuable mining documents. Joseph's face darkened with anger, but Samuel laid a restraining hand on his arm. It's a smart play, he said grimly. Now every desperate man in the territory will be looking for us, not just the Dawsons' hired guns. Elizabeth processed this news with remarkable composure. Does this change our plan? She asked Samuel directly. He exchanged looks with Thomas, who nodded once. It means we can't risk towns or settlements. No supplies, no fresh horses, and Tucson may be watched too closely now. Samuel ran a hand through his hair in frustration. We need a new destination. Swift Fox spoke again. There is a white man's camp 3 days northwest, railroad surveyors, many soldiers to protect them from Apache. He glanced at Thomas. The old one says the leader of these soldiers is known to you. Samuel's eyes widened in recognition. Captain William Hayes? He's here in the territory? Thomas nodded confirmation, surveying the new southern route. A good man, you once said. Samuel felt the first stirrings of hope. Hayes had been one of the few officers who'd treated the Apache scouts with respect during Samuel's army days. More importantly, he was incorruptible and carried enough authority to ensure the Dawsons' evidence reached the right hands. 3 days northwest, Samuel repeated thoughtfully. Against the current search pattern, it could work. Swift Fox departed with the falling of darkness, carrying a message from Thomas to the reservation elders, explaining their situation. The rest prepared to begin their desert crossing, gathering their meager supplies and checking weapons. As Elizabeth helped Joseph adjust his bandages for the journey ahead, she noticed the young man watching her with an intensity that suggested unasked questions. "What is it?" she prompted gently. Joseph hesitated, then spoke. "The scars you carry. I saw them when Thomas prepared the medicine." Elizabeth's hands stilled, her expression carefully neutral. "The men who attacked me were thorough," she said flatly. Joseph shook his head. "Not those scars. The older ones, on your back." Elizabeth looked away, an automatic defensive reaction she immediately regretted. These people were risking their lives alongside her. They deserved honesty, not evasion. "My father was a brilliant doctor," she said finally, "and a cruel man behind closed doors. My mother died when I was 8. After that, his discipline became more severe." Joseph absorbed this in silence, then spoke words that caught Elizabeth entirely off guard. "Among my people, scars are not hidden in shame. They are proof of what you have survived." He touched his own face, where a thin white line ran from temple to jaw. "My first hunt. A cornered deer lashed out. I lived. The deer did not. Both marks of honor." Elizabeth found herself without words, emotions threatening to surface that she had kept carefully buried for decades. Samuel's approach saved her from having to respond, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence. "We move in 10 minutes, he said, his tone suggesting he'd heard nothing of their exchange. But later, as they prepared to leave the safety of the cave, he paused beside Elizabeth. "Joseph is right, you know, about scars." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, a flash of understanding passing between them, before he turned away to lead them into the waiting darkness. The desert at night was transformed, the harsh glare replaced by silver moonlight, the scorching heat giving way to an almost pleasant coolness. They traveled in silence, Thomas leading with an unerring sense of direction that required no compass or stars. Samuel and Joseph flanked Elizabeth, all three moving carefully to protect their injuries while maintaining a steady pace. By dawn, they had covered impressive ground, finding shelter in a dry wash where massive boulders created deep shadows. As they settled in for the day, Samuel noticed Elizabeth examining a tattered map by the fading moonlight. "The evidence Running Elk sent you," he said quietly, settling beside her. "May I see it?" Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before retrieving a waterproof pouch from inside her jacket. "These are copies," she explained. "The originals are secure with my publisher in Chicago." She spread several documents between them: land surveys, mining claims, and most damning of all, internal correspondence between the Dawson brothers and territorial officials, including Sheriff Parker. Samuel studied the papers with growing anger. The conspiracy was even more extensive than he'd imagined. Systematic theft of Apache land, fraudulent mining claims, and bribes paid to ensure official cooperation. "This would be enough to bring down the entire territorial administration," he murmured. Elizabeth nodded grimly, "which is why they're willing to kill for it." Running Elk understood the scope of what he'd uncovered. She carefully refolded the documents. "But papers alone aren't enough. We need witnesses, testimony. Your voice, Samuel, and Joseph's." Samuel was silent for a long moment, weighing the implications. To testify meant permanently marking himself as an enemy of powerful men, men with long memories and longer reach. It meant no peaceful retirement in his cabin, no quiet life on the edge of Redemption Creek. But it also meant justice for Running Elk and protection for the reservation lands that remained. "You'll have it," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." The second night's journey proved more difficult than the first. Samuel's leg wound, though healing remarkably under Thomas's care, slowed their pace. Twice they were forced to divert their route to avoid search parties, distant campfires marking the presence of bounty hunters, drawn by the Dawsons' reward. By the time dawn approached, they had covered less ground than planned, forcing them to take shelter in a less than ideal location, a shallow cave barely deep enough to conceal them from passing riders. The cramped quarters put them in close proximity as they attempted to rest through another scorching day. Samuel found himself positioned between the cave wall and Elizabeth, acutely aware of her presence in the confined space. "You should sleep," he told her, noticing the dark circles beneath her eyes. Elizabeth offered a tired smile. "I could say the same to you." Despite the discomfort and danger, Samuel found himself strangely at peace. There was clarity in their mission that had been lacking in his life since the war. A clear purpose, a defined enemy, and companions he was coming to trust implicitly. By the third night, they were running dangerously low on water, each person limited to carefully rationed sips. Thomas assured them they would reach a hidden spring by morning if they maintained their pace, but the journey became increasingly arduous. Joseph's fever had returned, the infection in his shoulder fighting against Thomas's herbal remedies. Samuel and Elizabeth took turns supporting the young man between them, refusing to slow their progress despite their own injuries. During one such exchange, Elizabeth stumbled, nearly falling as fatigue and dehydration took their toll. Samuel caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "We'll rest a moment," he decided, helping her to a seated position on a flat rock. "Just breathe." Elizabeth didn't argue, a testament to her exhaustion. As she closed her eyes, focusing on steadying her breathing, Samuel found himself studying her face in the moonlight, the strength evident in every line, the determination that pushed her forward despite everything she had endured. In that moment, something shifted in his perception of her. This wasn't just Running Elk's correspondent or a journalist with a story. This was a warrior in her own right, fighting battles no less significant than those he had known in war. Dawn found them at the promised spring, a small but reliable source of water hidden in a rocky enclave. As they replenished their supplies, Thomas pointed to a distant mesa. "The white man's camp lies beyond. We will reach it by nightfall if we move soon." Samuel nodded, then turned to Elizabeth, who was helping Joseph drink. "We should discuss what happens when we reach Hayes." Elizabeth looked up, wiping sweat from her brow. "You make your report, present the evidence. Hayes sends it through official military channels where the Dawsons can't suppress it." Samuel shook his head slightly. "It's not that simple. Hayes can protect us temporarily, but he's here to survey railroad routes, not investigate territorial corruption. Once the Dawsons learn where we are, they'll bring whatever political pressure they can. We need to be prepared for Hayes to send us under military escort to Tucson, or even to California, where federal authorities can take proper statements." He hesitated, then added, "That could take weeks, maybe months." Elizabeth considered this. "My story needs to be published regardless. If something happens to us, the evidence still needs to reach the public." She turned to Joseph. "Are you prepared for what that means? Once your involvement is known, you may never be able to return to the reservation safely. Not while men like the Dawsons have influence." Joseph's eyes were fever-bright, but determined. "My uncle gave his life for this truth. I will see it through." Thomas, who had been listening silently, spoke. "The spirits have guided us this far. They will not abandon us now. Samuel wasn't sure he shared the old medicine man's faith and spirits, but he had developed an unshakable faith in his companions. Together, they had survived against formidable odds. Perhaps Thomas was right. Something beyond mere luck had guided their journey. Or perhaps it was simply the power of shared purpose, the strength that came from fighting alongside others against a common injustice. Either way, as they prepared for the final leg of their journey, Samuel felt more alive than he had in years. The railroad survey camp came into view with the setting sun, a collection of large canvas tents arranged in military precision, the stars and stripes flying from a central pole. They approached cautiously, aware that sentries would be posted and likely on high alert given the tensions in the territory. Samuel took the lead, moving with hands visible and calling out before they entered rifle range. "Captain William Hayes, it's Samuel Blackwood, formerly of the 4th Cavalry Scout Division." Their reception was predictably cautious. 4 soldiers with raised rifles forming a perimeter, while a 5th ran to fetch the captain. Hayes emerged moments later, a tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard and the weathered look of a career soldier. His eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed as he took in their bedraggled state and obvious injuries. "Blackwood," he said finally, "last I heard you were living the quiet life in some backwater settlement." Samuel managed a weary smile. "Things got complicated, Captain. We need your help." Inside Hayes's command tent, over hot coffee and the first real meal they'd had in days, Samuel laid out their situation, while Elizabeth presented the evidence. Hayes listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When they finished, he remained silent for a long moment, fingers steepled before him. "The Dawsons are powerful men," he said finally. "They've contributed significantly to the Territorial Development Fund. They have friends in Washington." Elizabeth leaned forward intently. "They're also murderers and thieves who've systematically violated federal treaties and corrupted local law enforcement." Hayes held up a hand. "I'm not disagreeing, Miss Hargrove. I'm merely stating the reality we face." He turned to Samuel. "You understand what you're asking. If I intervene officially, put the weight of the U.S. Army behind these accusations, there will be repercussions. Political pressure, possibly attempts to discredit the evidence or the witnesses." His gaze moved to include Joseph and Thomas. "All of you will be targets, not just for physical threats, but for character assassination as well." Samuel exchanged glances with his companions before responding. "We understood the risks when we started this journey, Captain. Nothing has changed except our determination to see it through." Hayes studied each of them in turn, taking measure of their resolve. Finally, he nodded once, decision made. "Very well. I'll dispatch riders at first light with copies of these documents, one to Fort Huachuca, where the territorial commander is stationed, another directly to Washington. I'll include my personal endorsement of your testimony." He turned to Elizabeth. "You mentioned copies with your publisher. When will those become public?" Elizabeth straightened slightly. "I dispatched a final article with all supporting documentation before leaving Santa Fe. It was to be published if I didn't send a countermanding telegram within 30 days. That deadline passes in 4 days." Hayes absorbed this with a grim nod. "Then timing is critical. You'll all remain under military protection until we receive orders regarding official testimony." As they were shown to a tent where they could rest, Elizabeth found herself walking alongside Samuel, their pace slowed by their respective injuries. "It's really happening," she said quietly. "After all this time, the truth will be known." Samuel nodded. his expression thoughtful. Truth has a way of emerging eventually, but it usually requires people willing to risk everything to bring it to light. He glanced at her with newfound respect. Running Elk chose his ally well. Elizabeth felt unexpectedly moved by his words. This taciturn man, whose approval suddenly mattered more than it should. "We should check your wound," she said, deflecting emotion with practicality. "And I need to look at Joseph's shoulder. The infection concerns me." Samuel accepted the change of subject, but as they parted at the entrance to the medical tent, where Joseph was already being tended by the camp doctor, he caught her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." The touch was fleeting, but its impact lingered long after Elizabeth had turned away. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Elizabeth stepped outside to find Samuel seated before a small fire, his rifle across his knees, in a posture reminiscent of how she'd first seen him at his cabin. "Old habits," he explained as she joined him. "Can't quite believe we're safe yet." Elizabeth settled beside him, drawing a blanket around her shoulders against the desert night's chill. "Do you think the Dawsons will come after us here? Attack a military camp?" Samuel stared into the flames. "Not directly, but they'll have learned our location by now. They'll be planning something." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the crackling fire and distant sounds of the camp the only interruption. "When I was first attacked in Santa Fe," Elizabeth said finally, "I almost gave up. Considered returning east, forgetting everything I'd learned about the Dawsons." She pulled the blanket tighter. It wasn't just fear. It was the humiliation, the feeling of violation, that they could simply take what they wanted, my dignity, my safety, with no consequences. Samuel listened without interrupting, sensing she needed to speak these words that had perhaps gone unspoken until now. "What changed your mind?" he asked when she fell silent. Elizabeth looked up at the vast canopy of stars overhead. "I received a package the next day from Joseph's mother, Running Elk's final letter, explaining that if I was reading it, he was already dead." Her voice caught slightly. "He wrote that some truths are worth dying for, but more importantly, they're worth living for, fighting for." She turned to face Samuel directly. "I couldn't let his death be meaningless. I couldn't let them win." Samuel held her gaze, seeing the strength that had carried her through everything. Not just this journey, but all that came before it. Without thinking, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Elizabeth didn't flinch from his touch as she might have days earlier. Instead, she leaned slightly into it, the simple human connection a balm after so much pain. The moment was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Captain Hayes, his expression urgent. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported. "A large party, moving fast, not military." Samuel was on his feet instantly, rifle ready. "The Dawsons?" Hayes nodded grimly. "Most likely. One of my scouts recognized James Dawson himself leading the group. They're flying a territorial marshal's flag, claiming official authority." Elizabeth stood as well, alarm evident in her expression. "They can't just take us, can they? Not from a military camp." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Technically, this is territorial land. If they have warrants issued by a territorial judge, the situation becomes complicated. My orders don't explicitly authorize me to harbor fugitives from territorial law." Samuel cursed under his breath. "They've outmaneuvered us. If they've convinced a judge to issue warrants based on false charges, they could legally remove us from your protection." Hayes held up a hand. "I said complicated, not impossible. Get Joseph and Thomas. Meet me in my tent in 5 minutes. We still have options." In Hayes's tent, the captain outlined their limited choices. I can refuse to surrender you, citing military jurisdiction over potential federal crimes. That buys us perhaps 48 hours before they return with orders from my commanding officer, who may not support my position. He pointed to a map spread on his desk. Alternatively, I can create a diversion while you four continue west with a small escort. Two of my most trusted men. There's a telegraph station at Cooper's Crossing, a day's ride from here. From there, we can send your evidence directly to Washington and request federal intervention. Samuel studied the map, considering. The Dawsons will anticipate that move. They'll have men watching the obvious escape routes. Hayes nodded agreement. Which is why you'll take the northern route, through Apache Pass. It's technically off-limits to civilians after the recent raids, but with Thomas as your guide, you should pass safely. Elizabeth exchanged glances with Joseph and Thomas. What about your men? Won't they face consequences for helping us evade territorial authorities? Hayes smiled grimly. My men follow my orders, Miss Hargrove, and my orders will be to escort you to the nearest federal jurisdiction for your own protection against credible threats. Nothing in those orders specifies which route to take. He turned to Samuel. Sergeant Miller and Corporal Dawes will accompany you. Both served with Apache Scouts before. They'll follow your lead in the field, Blackwood. Samuel nodded his acceptance of the plan, knowing it was their best option despite the risks. How soon can we move out? Hayes checked his pocket watch. The Dawsons party will reach our perimeter in approximately 1 hour. I'll stall them with military protocol and paperwork. You'll leave through the western edge of camp in 30 minutes. We'll provide fresh horses, supplies, and ammunition. He extended his hand to Samuel. Good luck, old friend. Send word when you reach Cooper's Crossing. As they shook hands, Hayes added quietly, Make sure this evidence reaches the right people, Blackwood. Men like the Dawsons have controlled this territory for too long. 30 minutes later, their small party slipped away from the camp, guided by Sergeant Miller, a stocky, taciturn man with a magnificent mustache and eyes that missed nothing. Corporal Dawes was younger, perhaps 30, with the relaxed competence of a natural soldier. Both men treated Thomas with the respect due an equal, further evidence of Hayes's careful selection. They rode hard through the night, pushing their fresh mounts to maintain distance between themselves and any potential pursuit. By dawn, they had reached the foothills leading to Apache Pass, where Thomas suggested they rest briefly before attempting the difficult passage. As they watered the horses at a small stream, Elizabeth found herself standing beside Samuel, watching the eastern horizon for signs of pursuit. We're going to make it, aren't we? She asked, voicing the hope she'd barely allowed herself to acknowledge. Samuel followed her gaze, then turned to meet her eyes directly. Yes, he said with a certainty that surprised them both. We've come too far to fail now. The journey through Apache Pass proved as challenging as Hayes had warned. A narrow, winding trail through rocky terrain that forced them to proceed in single file, constantly alert for signs of hostile activity. Thomas led with confidence, occasionally stopping to leave small arrangements of stones that Samuel recognized as Apache signs, messages to any warriors who might be watching that this party traveled under protection. By mid-afternoon, they had cleared the most dangerous section and paused to rest the horses on a plateau that offered a commanding view of the terrain they had traversed. Miller scouted ahead while Dawes maintained watch on their back trail. No signs of pursuit yet, the young corporal reported, joining the others for a brief meal of hardtack and dried beef. Though that doesn't mean they're not coming. Joseph, whose strength had improved dramatically with proper medical attention at Hayes's camp, studied the distant landscape thoughtfully. The Dawsons are not men who accept defeat easily. They will come. Samuel had just begun to suggest they continue their journey when Miller returned at a gallop, his expression grim. "Riders approaching from the west," he reported tersely. "Not military. 8, maybe 10 men." Samuel swore under his breath. "They've outflanked us somehow. Must have split their forces after we left Hayes's camp." He turned to Thomas. "Options?" The old medicine man considered briefly. "There is another way, more difficult, through the high canyon to the north. Few white men know it." Miller nodded. "We should move now, while we still have the advantage of position." As they quickly repacked their supplies, Elizabeth moved to Samuel's side. "If they've anticipated this route, they may have covered the others as well. Cooper's Crossing could be watched." Samuel checked his rifle methodically. "One problem at a time. First, we avoid this group. Then, we reassess." His calm practicality steadied her, as it had throughout their journey. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The high canyon route proved nearly impassable on horseback, a treacherous path of loose shale and narrow ledges that forced them to dismount and lead their animals for much of the way. Progress was painfully slow, each step carefully calculated to avoid sending cascades of rock tumbling below that might reveal their position. By nightfall, they had covered less than half the distance Thomas had hoped, forcing them to make camp on a narrow shelf barely large enough for their group. "No fire tonight," Samuel instructed, as they settled in for a cold, uncomfortable evening. They arranged watches, first Miller, then Dawes, with Samuel taking the pre-dawn hours when danger was typically greatest. As the others sought what rest they could on the hard ground, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep. The day's tensions still coursing through her body. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the stars visible through the narrow opening of the canyon above. Joseph joined her after a time, his movement careful and quiet. "My people believe the stars are the campfires of those who have gone before us," he said, following her gaze upward. "They watch over us on difficult journeys." Elizabeth smiled faintly, a comforting thought. She glanced at the young man beside her, seeing both his uncle's determination and his own distinct strength. "What will you do after this, when it's over?" Joseph considered the question seriously. "Return to my education, perhaps." Running Elk believed knowledge of both worlds was power. He gestured to the rugged landscape around them. "But I will never abandon this land or my people. Whatever path I choose must serve them as well." His eyes found hers in the darkness. "And you? Will you return east with your story?" Elizabeth had asked herself this same question repeatedly in recent days, finding her answer increasingly uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted. "There are more stories to be told here, more truths needing light, and more reasons to stay than she was ready to acknowledge, even to herself." Samuel's watch came in the coldest hours, the desert night reaching its lowest temperatures just before dawn. He moved silently among the sleeping figures, checking each before taking his position at the edge of their small encampment. His leg wound ached in the cold, but the pain was manageable, a reminder of survival rather than a hindrance. He found Thomas already awake, the old man sitting cross-legged facing the east, as though waiting for the sun that wouldn't appear for hours yet. "You should rest," Samuel said quietly, settling beside him. Thomas shook his head slightly. "I have lived many years, Samuel Blackwood. I need less sleep than the young." They sat in companionable silence for a time, two men who had seen enough of the world to value quiet moments. "The woman," Thomas said eventually. "She carries great strength and great pain, like you." Samuel didn't respond immediately, unsure what to make of Thomas's observation. "We've all endured our share," he said finally. Thomas turned to look at him directly. Some scars can only be healed by another who understands them. Before Samuel could respond to this cryptic statement, a sound from below caught his attention. The faint but unmistakable clink of metal against stone. He signaled Thomas to silence, then moved carefully to the edge of the shelf, straining to see into the darkness below. Nothing visible, but his instincts screamed danger. Moving with practiced quiet, he woke the others, communicating the threat with hand signals. Miller and Dawes immediately took defensive positions, while Joseph helped Elizabeth gather their essential supplies. "We need to move," Samuel whispered when they had assembled. "They're climbing the canyon. Must have spotted our trail before nightfall." Thomas pointed to a barely visible path leading higher up the canyon wall. "That way, it joins with a hunter's trail that will take us to the northern exit." Samuel made a swift decision. "Miller, you and Dawes hold this position as long as possible. Buy us time to reach the exit. Then follow if you can." Miller nodded grimly, understanding the likelihood that he and Dawes might not survive such a delaying action. "It's been an honor, Blackwood," the sergeant said simply, extending his hand. Samuel clasped it firmly. "Get to Cooper's Crossing if you can. If not, make them pay dearly for every step." As Samuel led Elizabeth, Joseph, and Thomas up the treacherous path, the first shots rang out below, Miller and Dawes engaging the climbing pursuers. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the canyon, creating a chaotic cacophony that made it impossible to gauge how many attackers there were or how the battle progressed. They climbed as quickly as safety allowed, Thomas leading with surprising agility for his age, Joseph helping Elizabeth over the most difficult sections. Samuel brought up the rear, rifle ready, expecting at any moment to see figures appearing below them. The gunfire continued sporadically, then fell silent, a stillness more ominous than the previous chaos. "Keep moving," Samuel urged the others. "Don't stop for anything." By the time they reached the hunter's trail Thomas had mentioned, dawn was breaking, providing enough light to move more quickly, but also making them more visible to anyone below. They had heard no sounds of pursuit since leaving the shelf where Miller and Dawes had made their stand. But Samuel took nothing for granted, setting a pace that balanced speed with caution. The trail wound along the upper reaches of the canyon, occasionally offering glimpses of the path they had ascended. During one such moment, Elizabeth paused, looking back. "Samuel," she called softly, pointing. Samuel followed her gaze to see two figures far below, moving with military precision up the same path they had taken. The distinctive shapes of cavalry hats identified them immediately. "Miller and Dawes," Samuel breathed, relief evident in his voice. They made it out. But his relief was short-lived. Behind the soldiers, more figures appeared, at least 6 men climbing in pursuit, closing the distance with every passing minute. "We need to reach the northern exit before they catch up to us," Samuel decided, urging the group forward at a faster pace. Thomas pointed to a notch in the canyon wall ahead. "There, perhaps 1 hour's journey." They pushed on, fatigue and injury forgotten in the urgency of escape. The hunter's trail grew increasingly narrow, in places barely wide enough for a single person to pass. A misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet to the canyon floor below. Behind them, the sounds of gunfire erupted again, Miller and Dawes engaging their pursuers once more, buying precious time for the others to reach safety. The exit came into view just as the gunfire below ceased completely. A gap in the canyon wall led to a sloping path that would take them down to the plains beyond. Joseph, "Take Elizabeth and Thomas through," Samuel ordered. "I'll hold here until Miller and Dawes arrive." Elizabeth started to protest, but Samuel cut her off. "The documents are what matter. Get them to Cooper's Crossing. I'll follow when I can." Joseph nodded, understanding the logic, even as he clearly disliked leaving Samuel behind. He urged Thomas toward the exit, but Elizabeth remained unmoved, her expression resolute. "We started this together," she said firmly. "We finish it together." Before Samuel could argue, figures appeared on the trail below. Miller supporting a limping Dawes, both men moving with desperate urgency. Behind them, the pursuers were no longer visible, but the sound of gunfire had ceased so recently that they couldn't be far behind. Samuel raised his rifle, preparing to cover the soldiers' retreat. "Go through the exit," he told Elizabeth. "Help Joseph get them down the other side. I'll follow once everyone is clear." This time, Elizabeth obeyed, recognizing the tactical necessity of his plan. Samuel took up a position with a clear view of the approaching trail, calculating angles and distances. Miller and Dawes were perhaps 5 minutes away at their current pace. Their pursuers couldn't be more than twice that distance behind them. It would be close. Miller and Dawes reached the exit point with the last of their strength, both men wounded but alert. "6 behind us," Miller reported breathlessly as Samuel helped them through the gap. "James Dawson leading them personally. They're determined, Blackwood. Never seen anything like it." Samuel nodded grimly. "Get down the slope. I'll hold them here as long as I can, then follow." He positioned himself at the narrowest point of the trail, leading to the exit, where attackers would be forced to approach single file. His Winchester would allow him to pick them off one by one as they came into view around the last bend. But as he settled into position, movement on the slopes above caught his eye. 3 men descending toward the exit from a different direction. Somehow, the Dawsons had split their forces again, approaching from multiple angles. Samuel realized with sinking certainty that he couldn't hold both approaches simultaneously. If he remained to delay the main group, the second team would reach the others before they could descend to safety. In that moment of decision, Elizabeth reappeared at the exit. "There are men coming down from above," she said urgently, confirming what Samuel had already seen. He made his choice instantly. "Change of plans. We go now, all of us. Help me set up a rock slide." Understanding immediately, Elizabeth joined him in loosening the already unstable rocks along the edge of the trail. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, they positioned the largest boulders they could manage at the critical point. "On my signal," Samuel instructed, waiting until the first pursuer came into view around the bend. He fired once, forcing the man back into cover. Then turned to Elizabeth. Now, together they shoved against the key boulder, starting a chain reaction that sent a cascade of rock tumbling down the narrow trail, effectively blocking it, at least temporarily. Without waiting to see the full effect of their work, they hurried through the exit to join the others, already descending the slope on the far side of the canyon. The descent was treacherous but quick, gravity doing much of the work as they half climbed, half slid down the rocky slope. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small valley with scattered pinyon pines offering some cover. "Which way to Cooper's Crossing?" Samuel asked Thomas as they caught their breath. The old medicine man pointed west. "Half the day's journey, but we have no horses now." Miller, leaning heavily on Dawes despite his own injuries, spoke up. "There's an old line cabin about 3 miles southwest. Army supply post. Rarely used these days, but might have emergency provisions. Samuel nodded. It's our best option. Can you make it 3 miles, Miller? The sergeant managed a pained grin. Carried men twice as far with worse injuries in the Apache campaigns. I'll make it. Samuel turned to check on Joseph and Elizabeth, finding both tired but determined. Let's move then. Stay in the tree line where possible. They'll be on our trail as soon as they clear that rock slide. The line cabin proved to be exactly as Miller had described. A simple one-room structure with a small corral, abandoned but still serviceable. More importantly, it contained emergency supplies, including hardtack, jerky, medical supplies, and ammunition. Samuel stationed Dawes, the least injured among them, as lookout, while the others tended wounds and replenished their strength. How long do you think before they find us? Elizabeth asked quietly, as she helped Samuel clean and rebandage his leg wound, which had reopened during their escape. Samuel considered their situation realistically. The rock slide will delay them, but not for long. Men like the Dawsons don't give up easily. I'd say we have maybe 3 hours head start, less if they found a faster route down. Elizabeth's hands paused in their work. Will we make it to Cooper's Crossing before they catch up? Samuel met her gaze directly. Some of us will. His meaning was clear. If necessary, some would stay behind to ensure the evidence and key witnesses reached safety. Elizabeth's expression hardened. That's not acceptable. She finished bandaging his leg and sat back on her heels. We've lost too much already. Running Elk, possibly Miller and Dawes if their wounds prove severe. I won't lose anyone else to the Dawsons' greed. Samuel was struck by the intensity of her declaration, the fierce protectiveness that extended to all of them now, not just her mission. Before he could respond, Dawes called from his lookout position. Riders approaching from the east. Samuel was on his feet instantly, moving to the cabin's single window with his rifle ready. Through the dusty glass, he could make out a group of mounted men, but not the pursuers they'd expected. These riders wore the distinctive blue uniforms of U.S. cavalry. It's a patrol, he said, relief evident in his voice. Army patrol from Fort Huachuca, most likely. Miller joined him at the window, squinting at the approaching soldiers. That's Captain Reynolds' company, he confirmed. Hayes must have sent word. The arrival of the cavalry patrol transformed their situation instantly. Captain Reynolds, a crisp, efficient officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, took charge with practiced authority. Captain Hayes sent dispatches explaining your situation. He informed them after introductions had been made. We're under orders to escort you directly to Fort Huachuca, where federal marshals are waiting to take your statements. He glanced at Miller and Dawes, and to provide medical attention to the wounded. We brought a wagon for those unable to ride. Samuel exchanged glances with Elizabeth, both processing this unexpected turn of events. What about the Dawsons? Samuel asked. They were close behind us with at least 9 men. Reynolds' expression hardened slightly. James and Robert Dawson were arrested 3 hours ago by federal marshals at their ranch. It seems evidence of their crimes reached Washington more quickly than anticipated. He turned to Elizabeth. Your publisher moved faster than expected, Miss Hargrove. The Chicago Tribune published your exposé this morning, complete with all supporting documentation. The journey to Fort Huachuca passed without incident. The presence of 20 heavily armed cavalry troopers discouraging any potential trouble from the Dawsons' remaining allies. Miller and Dawes were immediately taken to the fort's infirmary upon arrival, their wounds serious but not life-threatening. Thomas, whose knowledge of local medicinal plants had proven invaluable throughout their journey, was granted the unusual privilege of consulting with the Army surgeons on their treatment. For Samuel, Elizabeth, and Joseph, The next days passed in a blur of formal statements, sworn testimonies, and detailed accounts of everything they had witnessed and experienced. Federal marshals arrived from Tucson with additional evidence seized from the Dawson Ranch and the sheriff's office in Redemption Creek. The conspiracy, it seemed, had been even more extensive than they had realized, involving territorial officials all the way to the governor's office. 1 week after their arrival at Fort Huachuca, Samuel found Elizabeth sitting alone on a bench outside the officers' quarters, a newspaper spread across her lap. He settled beside her, noting the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of restless nights despite their relative safety. "Your story made quite an impact," he said, nodding toward the newspaper. Elizabeth managed a tired smile. "It seems so. The territorial governor has resigned. Federal oversight has been established for all mining operations on or near reservation lands. And the Dawsons," she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "They'll stand trial in Washington. Too many powerful interests were involved to trust a territorial court." Samuel nodded, understanding the significance of this development. Running Elk would be satisfied, I think. Justice may be slow, but it's coming. Elizabeth folded the newspaper carefully. Justice for him, protection for his people. That's what he wanted most. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the orderly activity of the fort around them. "Joseph has decided to return to school," Elizabeth said eventually. "After the trial, he wants to study law." Samuel smiled at this news, unsurprised. Running Elk would be proud. The boy has his uncle's determination. Another pause, then Elizabeth turned to face him directly. "And you, Samuel, what comes next for you?" It was the question he'd been asking himself since their arrival at the fort. His cabin in Redemption Creek no longer felt like home. Too many memories, too much blood spilled. "I don't know," he admitted. "The Army's offered me a position as liaison to the Apache Reservation, helping mediate disputes, ensure treaty compliance." He shrugged slightly. "Might do some good." Elizabeth studied his face. "Is that what you want?" The simple question caught him off guard. For so long, Samuel Blackwood had existed in a state of waiting, of marking time. Want had rarely entered into his calculations. "What I want," he said slowly, surprising himself with the words as they formed, "is to stop running from ghosts, to find purpose beyond survival." His eyes met hers. "The war, Antietam, the things I've done and seen, they'll always be part of me, but they don't have to define my future." Elizabeth's expression softened. Thomas would say, "That's wisdom." She hesitated, then continued, "I've been offered a position with a San Francisco newspaper. Regular column on territorial affairs. It would mean staying in the West." Samuel felt something shift in his chest at her words. Possibility opening where before there had been only resignation. "San Francisco's a long way from the Apache Reservation," he observed carefully, testing the waters between them. Elizabeth's smile held a challenge. "Not so far that stories couldn't be shared or visits arranged." She placed her hand lightly on his, the touch deliberate and unhurried. "Some journeys are worth making, Samuel Blackwood." The day of their departure from Fort Huachuca dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sky an endless expanse of blue. Thomas would return to his people on the reservation, his status enhanced by his role in exposing the Dawsons' crimes. Joseph would travel to Tucson to complete his testimony before returning to school in Santa Fe. Samuel and Elizabeth stood with them in the fort's courtyard, saying their goodbyes amidst the bustle of military routine. "Our paths will cross again," Thomas assured them, his weathered face serene in the morning light. The spirits have bound us together in ways that distance cannot break. Joseph embraced each of them in turn. The young man they had first met now standing taller, his purpose clear. "My uncle's letters to you," he said to Elizabeth, "they spoke of hope for understanding between our peoples. You have honored that hope." To Samuel, he added simply, "You were his brother in all but blood. Now you are mine as well." As Joseph and Thomas departed with their military escort, Samuel and Elizabeth remained in the courtyard, their own journey about to begin. Samuel would escort Elizabeth to San Francisco, ostensibly as protection until the Dawsons' trial concluded, though both recognized it as the pretext it was. "Ready?" Samuel asked, offering his arm with formal courtesy that made Elizabeth smile. As they walked toward the waiting stagecoach, Elizabeth paused suddenly, her hand moving instinctively to her side where her scars remained, healing but still tender. Samuel noticed the gesture, his expression softening with understanding. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, then met his eyes directly. "These past weeks, everything that's happened, I've kept people at a distance for so long, Samuel. Built walls that felt necessary for survival." She gestured vaguely toward her side. "These scars, the visible ones and those no one can see, they've been my excuse to avoid connection, to avoid risk." Samuel recognized the courage it took for her to speak these words, to acknowledge vulnerability when strength had been her armor for so long. "Elizabeth," he said gently, his voice holding none of its usual gruffness, "the Apache have a saying that Thomas shared with me. Scars are maps of where we've been, not directions for where we must go." He offered his hand, palm up, revealing his own collection of scars, some from battle, others from the harsh life of the frontier. "We all carry them. The question is whether we let them isolate us or connect us to others who understand." Elizabeth looked from his scarred hand to his face, seeing there the same difficult journey toward trust that she herself faced. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. "Please," she said softly, "don't touch my scars." The words hung between them, a test of trust, of understanding. Samuel nodded once, his fingers closing gently around her hand. "They are proof you're stronger than any blade," he said, echoing the wisdom Thomas had shared during their journey. "I won't touch them, but I will stand beside you while you carry them." Elizabeth felt something long closed within her begin to open. Not a wound, but a possibility. The future stretched before them like the vast western horizon, full of uncertainty, but also promise. As they boarded the stagecoach that would take them west, Elizabeth looked back one last time at Fort Huachuca, where their unlikely alliance had transformed into something neither had expected to find in the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory. Justice for running elk had been their purpose, but along the way, they had discovered something equally valuable: the possibility of healing, of connection despite the scars they both carried. The stagecoach lurched forward, beginning the long journey to San Francisco. Samuel sat across from her, his weathered face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. The burden of his past hadn't disappeared, nor had hers, but they seemed lighter somehow, shared between them. Outside the window, the desert landscape rolled past, beautiful in its harshness, resilient in its seemingly barren expanses. Like the land itself, they had endured, and like the unexpected wildflowers that bloomed after desert rains, something new was growing from soil that had seemed too damaged for life. "We'll be all right," Samuel said quietly, not as a question, but as a simple truth. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes meeting his with newfound certainty. The scars would remain, on her body, in his memories, in the land around them. But they were no longer barriers. Instead, they had become bridges, connecting two souls who understood that survival itself was victory, and that healing came not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone who honored both your wounds and your strength. As the stagecoach carried them westward, toward new beginnings, the sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, a reminder that even the harshest light created moments of shelter and respite. Elizabeth Hargrove and Samuel Blackwood had found theirs in each other, not despite their scars, but because of them. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.